of International Private Enterprise. It's being recorded. If you'd like to communicate any sort of technical problems, or more importantly, if you'd like to communicate questions to the panelists, please do so using the chat function. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew Wilson, the Executive Director for the Center for International Private Enterprise.
Good morning to you all, and on behalf of the Center for International Private Enterprise, I would like to welcome you to After the Pandemic, Rebuilding Global Supply Chains in ASEAN, a virtual event featuring speakers from Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam. This is the 9th in a series of public events on COVID-19 and corruption organized by our Anti-Corruption and Governance Center, headed up by Frank Brown. This event is also a collaboration with the UNDP's project Promoting a Fair Business Environment in ASEAN, or FairBiz. Just one example of CIPE's cooperation with UNDP in ASEAN and globally. In ASEAN, CIPE works with many partners to promote private sector anti-corruption and enable companies to take the lead in raising standards of business integrity. To introduce our discussion on the importance of integrity for ASEAN's COVID-19 economic recovery, I now turn the mic over to Brooke Horowitz, Senior Advisor to the UNDP FairBiz program and a longtime friend of CIPE. Brooke, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and it's great to hear and see old friends and new. As Andrew said, I'm representing the UNDP's Promoting a Fair Business Environment in ASEAN. This is a 3-year program funded by the ASEAN Economic Reform Program of the UK government's Prosperity Fund, and we call it the FairBiz Project. It's a multifaceted approach to reform both at public and private sector level in 6 ASEAN countries: Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, and also at the regional level. My particular responsibility is to work on the business integrity side, and I focus on, therefore, on the private sector. We've created a FairBiz Integrity Hub with 6 thematic platforms, one of which is the global supply chains, which is the thematic platform for that is linked to today's event. And it's a great pleasure to do this together with our friends at CIPE. Now, I'm absolutely certain that most of you who are working in the world of anti-corruption have had quite enough of linking COVID-19 and corruption. And you know, we've all been guilty perhaps of sort of overkill, excuse the pun, but now COVID is hopefully moving on, and we need to move on and look to the future as companies in ASEAN rebuild their businesses. And the contention that we'd like to make for today's discussion is that there's every opportunity to rebuild in a new way. There are going to be new investors re-entering the market. The environment, society, and governance, ESG factor, is going to be more important than ever. And quite frankly, the E and the S have been discussed a lot. The G seems to be a kind of thing that people expect, but actually we know very well that it is fairly neglected. The point is that the investments in the environment and society will not deliver their optimal return if the governance is absent or is weak. So the discussion for today is: how can companies, consultants, trade and business facilitators like our speakers and a lot of the people in the audience today, how can we help the ASEAN economies and their companies maintain and enhance their global competitiveness by raising their ethical standards, while at the same time rebuilding the markets and recovering their profitability? Our panelists today are very distinguished, and they're going to be looking at this very question from slightly different points of view. We've got a risk management consultant whose clients include some of the world's leading multinationals. We've got a political and governance analyst from a well-known think tank in Malaysia. And we've got the head of the Vietnam chapter of a US regional business association, John Bray of Control Risks, Ira Ajari of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, and Vu Tu Tan of the US ASEAN Business Council. A very warm welcome to you, and thank you very much for joining us today. Now, we'll hear from our speakers in a few minutes, but then we'll have time, I hope, for some discussion through the chat function. And we will be asking you not only to contribute questions, but also your experience of how to raise the standard of governance in the ASEAN region. What have you been doing? What are your achievements? And we would like you to look out for each other, because we're hoping that today's webinar will build on the excellent work already done by so many of you and point the way to new approaches and partnerships across the region. Now, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to our first speaker, John Bray. After that, Gibson Haynes of SITE will continue to moderate the session. I will disappear from the screen for now, and I'll see you all again during the discussion after our speaker's presentation. Thank you. John.
Great. Thank you very much, Brooks. And thank you very much to SIPE and UNDP for organizing this event. To elaborate on Brooks' introduction, I work for Control Risks. We're an international firm of, as our name suggests, risk consultants. I'm from the UK, but I'm based in Singapore. And I've been living in the region for 18 years. And my perspective is indeed an international one. We often say we work for headquarters companies. By that, though, we understand people who are headquartered in this region, as well as in the US, the UK, Europe, Australia. But we're also very interested in frontline operators, whether they work for larger or smaller companies. One thing that I wanted also to say is the focus of this discussion is on anti-corruption. I consider my work to have a even broader focus. I think a lot about business anti-corruption but also business and human rights. So I regard all those sets of issues as part of the G, and I think they should be considered together. So now I'm happy to hear Brooks starting on an optimistic note. I think we're ready for that. But next slide, please. I also want to start on a note of realism. We're not all there. Some of us, some of our friends, some of our colleagues, we're still in a sense of crisis mood. Some are moving on. So what do you do when you're in a crisis? Well, we help people to step back, take a considered view about what you know, what you assume, challenge the assumptions, and work out scenarios. So, next slide, please. What I would like to do is briefly think about where we are now and where are we now. I'm in Singapore, but it's a global map. It's a map of the world. Some points from that. Globalization is very much not dead. COVID is almost a symbol of globalization. This webinar is a symbol of globalization. But the pace of recovery is really very uneven in this region. From my window, I can see Indonesia, and from another window, I can see Malaysia. Even within this region, the pace is very uneven, as well as globally. In our global scenarios, our optimistic scenario is, quote unquote, uneven global rebound. It's not going to be a straight line, but it's not going to be one straight line. It's going to be several curvy lines. Definitely there's going to be a rethinking of supply chains. So part of the scenario is that some supply chains will become more local, more regional, but also definitely there is going to be long distance supply chains, and it's going to be for economic reasons. At the weekend, I was having a social chat with a friend who's a CEO in London. He was pointing out that from a Western European perspective, companies in recovery are cost sensitive. They're looking for value. Many of the value propositions are going to be found in this region. point which also follows from that, we're not just talking about the financial bottom line, that integrity, good governance is also part of the value proposition. So sitting from where I sit, I very much endorse Brooke's line on that. Integrity is part of recovery. It's not something that you postpone until later. And the reason for that is very clear. What you will become is related to what you are now. You need to be consistent in having a consistent approach to governance and to be able to articulate that to your business partners. So then, next slide bit, please. Stepping back a bit, this is a broader view of where we have been quite recently. These are some selected countries looked at from the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. And there are comparisons between what was happening in 2012 and what was happening last year in 2019. In general, on that index, you don't see much change from year to year. But I think we are seeing some patterns over the 8 years. From several countries have in fact hardly changed. Thailand is one, Japan is one, Hong Kong jurisdiction is one. From some quite high-ranking countries, New Zealand and Australia, particularly Australia, there's actually been a decline. But in some of the lower-ranking countries, there has been quite a significant improvement, including in this region. So Vietnam and Malaysia are both there. Myanmar and Indonesia are both there. What is the reason for that? Well, some positive aspects. I think there has been demonstrable political will. But we can also say that political will can go backwards as well as forwards. There can be political upsets. And indeed, we expect political upsets. So in our global scenarios, we're pointing to heightened geopolitical risk. However, to give some reasons for optimism, what are the drivers for the political will? Well, I suggest there are two drivers, both of which will continue to apply. One of them is external pressures. So it's the point which Brooke and I are both making, which is in order to be attractive to outside investors. I don't know if you can hear the thunderstorm in the background. To punctuate my speech, in order to be attractive to outside investors, you need to do something about governance. There's also internal drivers. This is what citizens want. It's an election winner if you can demonstrate that you are going to work for good governance. So then, next slide. I want to share some of what we are seeing in our work with companies on the governance side. What we are seeing is a lot of challenges. They include cybercrime, heightened risk, heightened threat of cybercrime. We are seeing greater corruption risks. It's because of temptations. It's because it's harder to keep a track of everybody. And we're also seeing fraud. So that's partly what the Scorpion is about. Part of the pattern is that when companies are under stress, things which were previously hidden come to the surface. And that may include long-standing fraud, not new fraud, but long-standing patterns which have been hidden but are now revealed. What we're also seeing is companies are happily willing to do something about it. They're putting money and effort into that. And here's a quotable quote. Working with one client, we were saying, well, look, we're delighted that you're addressing fraud. We're delighted that you're working with us. Frankly, we're delighted that you're paying our fees to do this. But actually, why? Why are you focusing on integrity issues now at a time of crisis? Surely your first priority is to get the business right. The answer comes in the next slide, please, which is we're running a marathon, and we're running a marathon, and you can't run a marathon with a broken leg. And working for a company which hasn't addressed integrity, that is like running a marathon with a broken leg. So therefore, next slide, please. What do we look for? What do we recommend? Summary, of course, is in the heading. It's a test of ingenuity. It's a test of stamina. It's a test of leadership. So part of what we recommend is what we've always been recommending, what you do in a compliance program. It's leadership, it's risk assessment, it's testing, it's training, it's communications. What's new? Well, leadership in particular, and then what aspects of leadership? Well, I think the key thing that I would emphasize, one thing above everything else, it's about how you treat people. It's how you treat your people. It's how you treat people in your own supply chains. And that question of relationships goes both forwards, it goes in both directions. It goes from the regional suppliers to global and international companies in both directions. We should be working on relationships. So therefore, what we are also saying to our clients, we are saying, what are your KPIs? What are your indicators? It is value for money. It is the financial ones, but it is also resilience. And resilience is about maintaining and cultivating those relationships. Small anecdotes. One of our clients had a crisis because of their supply chain, which was in this region. It was in the Philippines. They were missing a vital ingredient made by a factory in Luzon. No communications. They were about to basically collapse because of this vital communication. We were able to help them reestablish those communications, fix the supply chain. It was basically or partly a matter of communications. Actually, it was a failure on both sides. Failure both on the supplier in Luzon, a failure of the international company that they weren't looking after those relationships. So core message is concentrate on resilience. Part of that resilience is relationships. A core part of that is governance, and that is what you need. That is part of what you need to rebuild. Thank you. That's it from me, and over to Aira.
Thank you very much, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Gibson Haynes. I'm a program officer here at SIPE, and I work on Southeast Asia. So I'll be moderating the question and answer session, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Aira Jari, who is the manager of the Democracy and Governance Unit at IDEAS, the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Aira, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Gibson, and thank you to SIPE for inviting me to speak at this webinar today. As Gibson mentioned, I manage the Democracy and Governance Unit at IDEAS, so I will be looking at this topic more from a governance perspective, but also more on an institutional perspective as well. So first slide, please. I think before I begin going into the core of the issue, it would be useful to introduce everyone just to the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission Act 2009, which is the MACC Act, which is the key anti-corruption legislation in Malaysia. And the MACC is the primary investigative body for anti-corruption in Malaysia. And the reason why I'm bringing up the MACC Act before anything else is because I think it's important to take note that the Act itself does not make a distinction between private sector bribery and the bribery of public officials. So And I think this links also to some of the points that I will make later in my presentation, which is public versus private is also not a very straightforward distinction in Malaysia. Next slide, please. So the government if I'm not mistaken, in April 2018, Parliament actually agreed to pass an amendment to the MACC Act, which is Section 17A of the Act, which introduces corporate liability for bribery and corruption. Could we? Yes. So it introduced the offense of corporate liability, and companies in Malaysia were given more or less 2 years to try and adapt to this new amendment. So it has come into force quite recently on the 1st of June 2020. So that was only 10 days ago. And it criminalizes an organization for corruption-related actions by associated persons done for the benefit of the organization. So just to try and explain why this amendment is so significant. So before Section 17A was in the Act, only persons with the directing mind and will of the corporate entity could be charged. So with this amendment, it lowers the threshold to also include employees, regardless of status or function, as well as agents, distributors, and potentially joint venture partners. So as you can see, this widens the net significantly on who in the company can be criminalized for corruption-related activities. And I think this presents a significant step in trying to combat corruption in the private sector. It applies, I think further down the amendment, it defines companies as those registered in Malaysia. And of course, it's still very, very early to comment on its impact. But what I would say for now is it is a clear effort to further strengthen anti-corruption measures in the private sector in Malaysia. I pose a question here, could this be the answer to private sector corruption in Malaysia? Again, it's too early to tell, but I think the huge task now, I think for civil society and for the anti-corruption watchdogs is to really monitor its implementation. Next slide, please. So I know that in this webinar we aim to talk about private sector corruption, which obviously is a very important issue. But I think it's worth explaining that in Malaysia it's not a very straightforward distinction to make, public versus the private sector. This is because Malaysia's economy is characterized by a high presence of government. Strong presence of government through government-linked companies, GLCs. And the government is present in many different economic sectors in Malaysia, including, but not limited to, construction, property, telecommunications, and healthcare. Ideas actually has published several papers on this, which I can provide a link to if some of you are interested later. And so why did I bring up GLCs? Because the governance of these GLCs lack transparency and also democratic accountability, which then of course gives rise to a lot of risk of corruption. So some examples of weak governance systems and the lack of institutional checks and balances. When it comes to GLCs, an example is that there is essentially no parliamentary scrutiny on the performance of these GLCs. This is in spite of many of these companies, whose mandate is to carry out a strong social objective, providing utilities, water, electricity, and so on. And also there is no transparency on the appointment process for top management of these GLCs, for example. And of course, there is that bigger question of, is this strong government presence in the economy crowding out private sector? And that's a question that many scholars have asked over the years, and it's something that IDEAS has worked on as well before. Next slide, please. So here are just some of the post-pandemic risks that I see in the corruption environment. So I think firstly, procurement. So public procurement has always been one of the biggest sources of corruption in the country. The government's National Anti-Corruption Plan highlighted corruption as being the highest number of complaints received by the MACC. So the procurement system in Malaysia is large and complex, and I wouldn't want to get into all the details now, but I think the economic hardship and the significant slowdown in business and demand will probably create higher pressure by Malay groups for the government to support Malay businesses. So in the procurement system in Malaysia, there is a preference for Bumi Putra contractors. So Bumi Putra are primarily consists of the Malay ethnic group in Malaysia, and there is a margin of preference for Bumi Putra contractors to receive government contracts. And as you can imagine, that system has created some controversy, but also I think there's been generally just a lack of transparency in how that preference is managed. So I think now that with the economic hardship that's facing a lot of businesses today, I think there is a risk of increasing pressure by Malay groups for government to support Malay businesses. And I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with that, but I think the lack of transparency, I think, would be problematic. And the second one is, of course, GLCs, as I highlighted before. I think we can expect a heavier involvement of government in the economy. Now that with the post-COVID environment, I think there will be expectation of government going into, I think, more sectors of the economy to stimulate those sectors. So political instability, I think I brought that up because that obviously has impact on corruption. So conflict of interest between politicians and businesses, I think will increase. And we are seeing some of that already through the appointment of many politicians onto either the board or into the management of some of these government-linked companies, either at the federal or at the state level. And the fourth one is weak institutions. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Malaysian politics, but at the end of February this year, we had a change of government, but not through elections. So so it was a power grab essentially by the opposition parties at the time, and a new coalition is now in power. But there has not been a proper parliamentary session yet since then. We had one, but it was essentially just a one-day session, with just the King's speech, and there was no debate at all. So this is obviously an area of concern from civil society, because I think the government has had like 4 stimulus packages for COVID, which has not been tabled in Parliament at all. So there's been like zero parliamentary scrutiny on government spending since this new government got into power. So that's definitely a concern. I'll just end my presentation. There is no slide on this, I apologize, but on just some suggestions on what can be done. And again, I think my suggestions are primarily on institutional level. So firstly, I think, Parliament needs to convene and sit for more than one day. So the opposition needs to be given room to scrutinize some of these government decisions, government spending for COVID. Secondly, I think civil society, will need to closely monitor the implementation of Section 17A to ensure that it's been done transparently and with accountability. And also, I think the third one, which I think is quite vague, but to me, I think is the most important here, which is trust in government really needs to be restored. So the Malaysian government, as I think you know, has done particularly well in combating COVID on the healthcare front. We are already at single digits for new infections. We've had a very high recovery rate, and I think we've performed quite we've been quite an example in the region on the healthcare front. And I would give credit to the Ministry of Health, particularly the Director General for this, but not so much on other fronts. So I think on many other fronts, this current government has suffered a significant trust deficit. And I'll give you some examples. The former Prime Minister's son, former Prime Minister Najib Razak's son, Riza Aziz, was discharged quite recently from his charges, a discharge not amounting to acquittal. And also a few days ago, we got news that the former Chief Minister of Sabah, a state in East Malaysia, Musa Aman, has been acquitted of all 46 charges of corruption, abuse of power, and all that. So there's been a significant, I think, backsliding in anti-corruption work, in democracy, and I think that really needs to be restored. And as I like what John mentioned in his presentation, which is integrity is not something you postpone to later. And of course, good governance and trust in institutions is absolutely essential for private businesses to come in and invest in the country, especially in this current economic situation. So I think that's all from me, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your presentation. That was great and very cogent. Folks, I also want to encourage you to use the chat function to include any questions that may be coming up during these presentations. Thank you so much. I would like to turn now to Vu Tu Tan, who is the Deputy Regional Managing Director and Chief Vietnam Representative for the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. Vu, please take it away. Thank you.
Sure. Please remember to turn my video on, because I just couldn't do it on my phone. But anyway, hello everyone. Nice to talk to you at this time. I am Vu Tu Tan, and I run the Vietnam operation for the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, and I also have a small regional role as the Deputy Regional Managing Director for the organization. I have been on this job for 13 years, and our job is to help our member companies who are American companies, some 160 of them, most of them operating on a global and regional scale. We work closely with the governments in the region to promote policies that are conducive to business, that benefit both the local economies as well as the businesses, both local businesses as well as foreign businesses. And obviously, from our company's perspective, ESG is an important part. In fact, we also see that as a competitive advantage. So the future of business, if not society, lies with ESG, right? So whichever business that gets ahead of the curve and fully embraces ESG, then that business would naturally enjoy the competitive advantage. And we have been encouraging the economies in Southeast Asia to to go in that direction. So I will have about 5 minutes left to go through these points. So as you can see on the screen, so let's go to the first slide. Next slide, please. Now, as you probably know, Vietnam has been fortunate enough to get ahead of the curve in the fight against COVID, right? Which allows the economy to start the post-pandemic recovery earlier than most other economies in the world. And most recently, the government met and decided to do something to attract what they see, and not only they, many other countries in the region see as a trend of companies diversifying away from China. And you're looking to either expand their operations or make new investments in the countries in the region, including India and Southeast Asia. So a task force on this has been or is in the process of being established, led by Deputy Pham Binh Minh, who is also the foreign minister, and they are tasked with looking at ways to attract the big techs and major global supply chains. Now, this is happening against the backdrop of Vietnam's moving towards a new phase of foreign direct investment policy, as decided by the Politburo, the top decision-making body in the country, and they have devised sort of some major guidelines for attracting FDI until 2030, and the government is in the process of developing an execution plan for the next 10 years. The task force is also studying what other countries are doing to attract new FDI and what these big techs and major global supply chains need. And obviously, you know, in this effort, one country certainly cannot do it all. They need to work with other countries. No country can, no single country can compare to China. So for Vietnam, in order to attract these new and presumably high quality investors, they need to work with other fellow ASEAN countries. Next slide, please. Please, next slide.
Yeah, just a second.
All right.
Speaking.
All right. Sorry. Well, can you back? This is the last slide, right? Right. So this is the right slide. So Vietnam. I mean, speaking about corruption, my two fellow panelists have covered quite extensively. Now, from Vietnam's perspective, I believe that the government has learned an important lesson from their success in the fight against COVID, and that is transparency actually pays. Now, to give them to do them justice, the fight against corruption in Vietnam was already going on before COVID. And it has produced some significant results. including the jailing of a large number of officials, including the very high level ranking officials. But the fight against COVID, the government learned that when they were upfront, they were transparent and upfront about the decision-making process, the rationale for drastic policies, and the need for people's participation in the process, then that policy would produce very positive results. So in the fight against COVID, Vietnam had been transparent right from the beginning. The government sought to inform the public as information came in, and they were able to generate a lot of public support in the various public opinion surveys about public confidence in the government's measures against, to control the pandemic. Vietnam always scored among the top. Well, I think Vietnam scored the top in those surveys, right? And so again, they can take this best practice in fighting COVID to running the economy, and again, transparency it pays off. Also, another drive for Vietnam's boost in transparency and the fight against corruption is its participation in some of the latest and high quality 21st century free trade agreements, such as the Comprehensive Partnership Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, or CPTPP, and the recently approved Europe-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. Both of these FTAs have important provisions that require greater transparency. And in fact, proponents of these FTAs in Vietnam aim to use these FTAs to boost for greater transparency and better governance internally here in Vietnam. So this obviously helped with the fight against corruption. And then, as I alluded to it before, the Communist Party of Vietnam's anti-corruption drive still keeps very strong momentum as they head towards the next party congress in the first quarter of next year. And then, as you can see recently, the US government is making overtures about an economic prosperity network in the region. And that network obviously is calling for the same standards among all these participating countries or economies. And by same standards, we mean that all these countries have the same sort of anti-corruption standards, right? The United States, for example, has its well-known FCPA rules, and we want all other countries to have sort of the same strict standards, so that our companies can compete on an equal footing. And lastly, another major factor that helps with the fight against corruption is the fast-going digital transformation of the government and of the economy in Vietnam. The Vietnamese government, for example, has just introduced its e-government platform that aims to process a bulk of administrative procedures. And obviously, you know, when people work through this platform, the chances for corruption are greatly reduced. I don't have much time left, so let's move on to the last slide, please. And that is, you know, the role of industry. Where do the businesses fit in this whole picture? Well, obviously, companies, especially foreign companies wanting to do business in Vietnam, have an inherent interest, right? In well, but I mean, you don't want just to invest in the business only. You also want to invest in the entire environment to improve it, so that your business can prosper. And by that I mean you can partner, you know, as we help our member companies, you can partner with the government of Vietnam and the legislature on reviewing and commenting on the existing and draft pieces of legislation and regulations. As we do that, you know, we tend to increase transparency in those legislative pieces and create a level playing field. Now, some people may be concerned about the influence of foreign businesses, and they want to erect protectionist measures in these legislative pieces. But you know, we have been successful on many occasions to convince them of the benefit of a playing field and the opportunities to increase the competitiveness of the local industry, you know, when they compete on a level playing field. And second, you know, as we are an American business association, we also partner closely with the United States government and also other governments in the region in the fight against corruption. We often either our own or you know, joint programs offering technical assistance and education on FCPAs for the stakeholders in Vietnam, which include government officials as well as local businesses. We also want or encourage the industry to their experience about business ethic dividends, right? So, normally, you know, some companies may think that, well, you know, because they are constrained by FCPAs, they tend to compete at a disadvantaged position vis-a-vis other companies from other countries who are not bound by similarly strict anti-corruption rules. Well, that's understandable, and that could be sort of a knee-jerk reaction. But over time, you know, those companies that uphold strong FCPA rules, they really see dividends, right? They really see the benefits, you know, of staying straight, so to speak, like that, because you know, they were able to avoid all the risks associated with you know, cutting corners, so to speak, right? And the last point I'd like to recommend is you know, for the industry to work with relevant stakeholders to create an honor roll of local business partners and highlight those who have been rewarded by transparency and compliance. Now, you just can't talk about fighting corruption without involving the local industry, the local business partners, right? So that's an important ally especially for foreign companies looking to do business in the region, particularly in Vietnam. So I'll just leave it there and look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tan. I very much appreciate it. It's now time for the question and answer portion of today's webinar. Thank you to everyone who's already put in questions in the chat. Briefly to follow up on Tan's point there at the end, the creation of kind of coalitions of companies who operate ethically is one of SIPE's main programs, both in Thailand and in Indonesia. So if that is an interesting idea to you, I highly encourage you to reach out to us to find out more about that. The first question is for Ira. How could you talk a little bit about how the private sector has reacted to Section 17A coming online, and particularly also whether there is any government guidance on what qualifies as an adequate procedure for companies trying to comply with this?
Hi, thanks, Gibson. And thanks for the question. I'm afraid that I'm not a corporate lawyer, so my answer probably would lack some detail. But I'll try my best to look at it in a broader sense. So to your first question on how the corporate sector has reacted, I think at the time when the amendment was passed, the Section 17A was passed in 2018. I think in general, there was a greater demand for a higher accountability, a greater transparency when it comes to companies. I think the context of that was, of course, you know, with 1MDB and there was just a heightened awareness on that. But also, I think there were some concerns about the all-encompassing nature of the amendment and how that might present some sort of hindrance to businesses, because, you know, naturally, you know, the basis of entrepreneurship is for people to take great risks in expanding their business. So there was, I think, some concern that it might impede that kind of risk-taking that we expect from entrepreneurs. But I think on the whole, I don't think there was too much backlash. In terms of the guidance, you are right. So the MACC did publish a guideline on the adequate procedures, and without going into too much detail, they clustered the procedures behind 5 principles. There's an acronym called TRUST, which is TRUST. So T is top level commitment, R, risk assessment, U, undertake control measures, S, systematic review, monitoring and enforcement, and T is training and communication. So I think these 5 principles are sort of these best practices that's expected from companies in order to comply to Section 17A. And yeah, so I would expect that you know, most companies, at least you know, at least the bigger ones, I think by now would probably have done some part of these guidelines. Although I would also just like to add that you know, if the company is in a regulated industry or is in multinational corporation, more likely than not, there would already be some check and balance controls in place to ensure proper corporate governance. Some companies, you know, even before Section 17A was in place, have already signed the Corporate Integrity Pledge with the MACC and have obtained the ISO 37001 Anti-Bribery Management System certification, you know, to further their anti-bribery commitment. So these are steps that's already been in place, and I think these guidelines are a step further, I think, in that. And and I think in civil society especially, we would be looking forward to see what the impact is now that it's actually been enforced. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Aya. We'll turn to ISO 37001 in a moment, but in the meantime, speaking of tone from the top and commitment from the very top levels of companies, how can we as the private sector, as business associations and NGOs, stimulate awareness of anti-corruption necessities for boards of directors and people at the high levels of companies? I think this is a question for all of the panelists, because it is quite an important component of anti-corruption commitments for the private sector.
Shall I have a go at that? So first point, I think some of the direction should come from inside the company, even though that may be difficult. It's good practice to have training for the board. And if the board has a political appointee, then they should be part of it. But a core part of the argument, it can be presented in technocratic way. So anti-corruption is good governance, but it's about saving money. It's about not spending money unnecessarily. It's about being competitive. It's about meeting demands. That partly relates to the question about adequate procedures. So as Ira was pointing out, adequate procedures is not just, in fact, the adequate procedures in the Malaysian law are modeled on the UK law. So international partners have a set of requirements which they can and should communicate to their local partners. So basically the argument will be the one that everybody here would be making, which is that it's good business. And that should come from internal as well as external.
Thank you, John. Tan, did you have something to offer on that question?
Well, I just want to expand on my point earlier, and that is,
oh, sure.
Our companies tend to be, because they are legally bound by FCPA rules. So the board and every employee in each company would have to be frequently trained on FCPAs, right? But that's what I would say the stick approach. I'd also like to mention the carrot aspect of that, and that is what I call business ethic dividends, right? In fact, investing in compliance, investing in anti-corruption actually would save the company a lot of money, right? And ensure a sustainable and low risk growth strategy. So as a company looks to maximize its profit, this is just a right strategy to maximize profit as any other strategy. So that's my point, and the carrot aspect of anti-corruption.
Thank you, Tan.
Can I come in here, Gibson?
Yes, please, Brooke.
Well, I'm very glad you mentioned that, Tan, because I think this question of incentives and putting the positive spin on this, you were talking about business integrity rather than anti-corruption and the benefits of it. These are the really important points, and it becomes very difficult to argue this if it's purely on a negative, on the negative side. Having said that, you have to recognize that the global multinationals, the US corporations, the UK companies are very much under the thumb of this quite draconian legislation. And the way the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US has been enforced in recent years is quite frightening, I could imagine, for companies. It keeps the CEOs of US companies awake at night, I could imagine.
Right.
And by the way, 98% of the FCPA cases in recent years have been attributed to supply chain criminality, not necessarily employees of the companies themselves. So this is a very pertinent risk for those companies. What I don't quite get, though, is that if it's true what you say, that that there is a positive dividend, then why wouldn't companies actually do more to help educate their supply chains in this? Because please tell me that I'm wrong, somebody, but my impression is that companies are still, the global multinationals are still doing the minimum that they need to do in order to protect themselves. What it is adequate procedures, using the UK Bribery Act terminology. It may be an anti-corruption clause in a distributor agreement. Of course, that keeps the mother company clean and clear of any kind of real bribery that may be going on at the local level in one of these countries. So I'm just thinking, why wouldn't global multinationals be really proactive in educating the companies that are in their supply chain? And please tell me that this is happening, but I'm sort of underwhelmed by what I can see. Complete silence, or you're all on mute.
Thanks, Brooke.
Just quickly, I'm not quite as cynical as you. So what the clause in the contract to distributors, that's one element. It'd be selecting the right distributor in the first place. What we also say is communications and monitoring. Many of the companies that we deal with actually are quite strong on forms of education of their third parties, and it's not just contracts; it's also suppliers' codes. I'm just now putting together a proposal in which the client is making a point of telling us that we have to abide by their code. No problem in that. Glad they say it, but the forms of education are in fact taking place. So not so cynical. Of course, some will do it in just to cover themselves. But if you, and that's another aspect, if you get somebody to sign a contract, but then don't do anything about briefing them, then that's not an adequate procedure. And you may get caught out.
I mean, I'd just like to ask Tan, thank you for that, John, but I'd like to ask Tan, do you think, if a US or British company comes in with its sort of, global code of conduct and the corporate training program from the global level, admittedly translated into Vietnamese, would that be comprehensible to a Vietnamese company? I mean, would they get it, or does there have to be some kind of more specific adaptation of this to not only the Vietnamese language, but the Vietnamese business culture, which I would have thought is quite different?
Well, I like, Brooke, I like your earlier observation, about why the MNCs have not invested enough in sort of, building the capacity of their local supply chain on anti-corruption and FCPA compliance. It's true, from my own personal observation over the years, I can see that these MNC invest significantly in the legal aspect. of that, right? So they have their lawyers train their employees and their partners on FCPA compliance and all sort of thing, and that's and by the way, these trainings are mandated by FCPA rules and law, right? So it looks like they are forced to do so, right? Instead of seeing that as sort of an inherent and in fact profitable, so to speak, activity, right? I mean, to use the word enlightened self-interest, right? It's in your own corporate interest, right, to build the capacity of your local of your partners in the supply chains or local partners, right? So that you can manage the risk level and ensure sustainability in your business. Now, this is my personal opinion only, and I think that the reason for the lack of investment, both in terms of resources as well as attention in building capacity for the supply chain and local partners, is because these companies or most of these companies don't seem to sort of have exclusive use of the local supply chain, right? So, for example, a supplier can supply for several clients, and if just one company invests in that, then it would put them in sort of a disadvantaged positions, cost-wise, right, expense-wise, vis-a-vis the other companies who do not invest as much. So this brings back to the point I made earlier, that industry has to work together. This is not just some individual effort. It has to be a well-coordinated effort among the companies and among governments. We need to have sort of a well-coordinated campaign on this to make sure that everybody has their fair share of investment on this, and nobody is a free rider on this. So this is something. I mean, the value proposition here is this is a serious business, right? This can save you a lot of money. This can reduce the risks, and everybody has a fair stake in this. So
Thank you, Tan.
I'm not sure if that answers your question, Brooke.
Well, it does very much, and it just makes me feel that my observation is that companies will make these investments as individual companies, and it's a rather big step for them to go into the collective action mode where they're working together. But this is the one place where they could work together, because they're not supposed to be competing on whether they're more ethical or less ethical. Right. They're supposed to be, everybody's been talking about it for years. You've got to build a level playing field, and that's a level playing field amongst multinationals as much as everybody else. So,
precisely.
And then again, my observation is that there's some really good local efforts. Some of them are being stimulated and managed by SIPE, other ones by the UNDP Fair Biz project. For example, in Vietnam, the UNDP's been cooperating with the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce to produce. There's a website on business integrity in the Vietnamese language. There's a course on internal control systems and codes of conduct. which is reacting directly to the provisions, excuse me, in the new anti-corruption legislation in Vietnam, the revised law. And you know, I can see Vietnam Chamber of Commerce doing a fantastic job in training companies, and you know, they've got their kind of companies that they deal with, but it seems to me that this is a product, if you like, that could easily be channeled through the supply chains of the multinationals. And I believe that the small and medium-sized enterprises in those supply chains will really sit up and pay attention if it's coming from the global multinational and not just from VCCI, which is perceived to be, to a certain extent, part of the government apparatus.
To some extent, to follow on that, we've gotten a couple of questions about different specific plans to incorporate business integrity and things in operations. One of which, of course, is the ISO 37001 anti-bribery management system from the International Standards Organization. Now, this is quite a heavy, as it were, system that has a lot of different requirements. Is that something that you're seeing being implemented within ASEAN, and is that necessarily applicable for all companies, or are there other systems and approaches that could also be beneficial?
Shall I pick up on that? I like the ISO 37001. I mean, it's quite adaptable, it's flexible, it talks about risk assessment, so what is adequate for you. So I think it's good. It has all the essential things of the UK Bribery Act and the FCPA. It's actually an advantage that it's not linked to any particular country, so you don't need to feel that you're signing up to a British post-colonial legacy or something like that. It is demanding, but I think that's a good thing. As for take-up, I guess I have to use the word uneven, but it would be good if it were taken up more. So I think it's a useful instrument, a useful thing to have in the toolbox.
Thank you. So then on that front, how can companies kind of increase their effective dialogue with public authorities and with other economic stakeholders to make sure that this actually happens? What kind of mechanisms do you see as most effective, either where they already exist or where they could exist in the future?
Well, I personally, I mean, I've done more work in Vietnam than in any of the other countries, so please excuse me for coming back to the example of Vietnam. You know, a few years ago when I started to get involved, the topic was very new. The revised law hadn't come into force, and I must say that I was quite impressed by the willingness of all parties to come together and have these discussions. And I think what was quite, I mean, there are certainly quite a few defects about the revised law on anti-corruption, and this is part of an issue of how parliaments and democracy works. But the fact of the matter is the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce did take a very proactive line on this. They developed the training, they developed a whole they developed a program of collective action. It's called the Government Business Integrity Initiative. It's a bit low key. It's really for policymakers and business facilitators. I don't suppose the business community knows a lot about it, but it exists, and it is a series of dialogues and consultations between the government and the business facilitation people and the anti-corruption community, the fledgling anti-corruption community in Vietnam. And I think that has led to quite a lot of progress. I mean, I don't think it's an accident that Vietnam is now moving forward quite rapidly in this area. The fact of the matter is you can introduce a law like the MACC Article 17A, or you can introduce the anti-corruption revised law in Vietnam, and it means nothing other than the paper it's printed on, unless you've got the companies and the business associations really promoting it, really understanding it. We did a survey of companies about when the law first came out in Vietnam to understand, how much do they really get it? Do they understand what an internal control system is? Do they know what a code of conduct is? And there was a whole section of the Vietnamese business community, admittedly the smaller and smaller companies, that had no idea. So there's a great big gap between the ambition of the legislation and the reality on the ground. I could imagine in Malaysia, we're going to see something similar, especially if the new government is not 100% behind the legislation that was effectively introduced earlier. Ira, maybe you'd care to comment on that.
Can I just make a quick, and the issue is about dialogue. The more specific, the better. So I think we got beyond the stage where we say corruption is a bad thing. We know that. Specific dialogue on specific measures to do something about it, for example, in procurement, in tax collection, or in customs. That gives quite an agenda to start.
I'll just add just very quick remarks on that. I think in Malaysia, anti-corruption efforts has largely been done by civil society. This is I think it's a bit different in countries like Indonesia, where the KPK, is, very enthusiastic and really goes out there to, to enforce its authority and also to educate the public about the effects of corruption. But I think in Malaysia, because the MACC has had a history of, there are issues with the integrity of the MACC itself. And this includes when, Pakatan Harapan was in power. So I think that makes the situation a bit more different in Malaysia. And, and because civil society is so much at the forefront of anti-corruption work in Malaysia, I think that really needs to be strengthened further. And there was a question about how, how can companies engage more constructively with governments and regulators to make sure that demand of corruption from public officials also mitigated. So I think this is a good question, which I don't really have an answer to, but I think this goes back to the link, as I showed earlier in my presentation, between between politics and business, which in countries like Malaysia is so intertwined and so inextricably linked that it is inevitable that public officials and politicians use companies, private companies, as vehicles to for political financing and all of that, which is a big problem in Malaysia. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Ira. There's that really kind of brings up the necessity of collective action as one approach to dealing with that, because of course it's a difficult one, but it's one of the few that gets a kind of magnified private sector voice to talk with government about the challenges that they're seeing from government. So to wrap it up, I'd like to turn to Brooke to provide some closing remarks. Thank you all for an engaging discussion and some really good answers to these questions we've received from our attendees.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gibson. And first of all, thank you so much to John and Tan and Ira for coming on today and spending their time sharing ideas, and to all of our audience for staying with us and for participating. I'm sorry we started a bit late and we're going to have to finish on time, but I hope you found it useful, and thank you for your questions and comments. And It's the beginning of a discussion, as I was saying at the beginning of today's session. I think that multinationals, large local companies, business associations, the kind of organizations that some of you represent that support business in the fight against corruption, NGOs, we're really all going to have to work together on a new level if we're going to make a dent in this, if we're going to have impact, if we're going to scale up. Because if we don't, then we'll be having this conversation in the next 5 years or 10 years' time. God willing, CIPE will be able to continue its series on anti-corruption into the future. But I would hope that we'd be able to feel that the organizations that are facilitating and are motivated to change behavior will be able to do that. And they'll be doing it by setting their own example, but also providing tools and training and mentoring to the less experienced companies. This is a big cultural change that has to take place. And by the way, of course, it's not just in ASEAN, it's in our own societies, as we've seen very graphically in the last few weeks. This is a big, big topic, but I think that people with knowledge and experience, like the panelists and the people in the audience, really do have an opportunity to make a big difference. So that's the tone, if you like, that I'm very keen on, and I hope that you will be too. Very happy for you to reach out to me or to my colleagues in UNDP, and of course to Andrew and Frank and Gibson in CIPE, to continue the dialogue offline. I'm going to give one final little plug to my UNDP Next event, which is coming up on the 18th. We've produced a business integrity toolkit for young entrepreneurs. So this is for the new generation. And we'll be launching that on 18th of June at a webinar at 1 p.m. 18th of June.
All right, thank you, everyone. Okay, I think you muted yourself. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, again for attending. As Brooke mentioned, CIPE is also happy to participate and to keep this conversation going with you into the future. Feel free to reach out to us at acgc@cipe.org or check out our website. And also, please keep in touch and keep an eye out for the recording of this event that will come out shortly. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.